One of the most common questions I get asked is, how do I improve at chess? And this is a very difficult question that you can answer in a myriad of ways and not really be wrong with any of them. But it's fair to say that one of the most common answers is calculation. Working on your calculation will help your game dramatically, but understanding how to calculate, why you calculate, and really anything involving calculation can be tricky. So I thought it would be nice to discuss it at length in this video. So now we have to ask ourselves, what is calculation? And I know, so that's kind of a stupid question because, well, we kind of know what calculation is even if we can't verbalize it, but let me try my best. Calculation is what you do to achieve a certain strategic goal by force. So, for example, if you are losing in a position and you find a tactic that will give you a perpetual check, allowing you to draw the game, congratulations. That's a tactic that you need to calculate. Or if you can win a piece by force, that's another goal that you are extremely happy to get. So, when you have a strategic goal in mind and you can force it, that's kind of what calculation is for. So in order to calculate properly, we look at forcing moves first. And forcing moves, I'll go over them in level of severity, start with checks. For example, when you're in check, you can only capture the piece, block the piece that's giving you a check, or move your king out of the way. If you can't do any of these three things, then it's a checkmate. So that's actually really good to know. The next thing is a capture. Because it's strategically desirable to capture some of your opponent's material because it gives them less control of the position, well, they might have to respond to it with a recapture or by creating some sort of attack on their own. So material is extremely important to be aware of. And then the last thing is a threat. So you can make a threat and maybe your opponent doesn't have to respond to it, as they might have a move that's even more forcing than yours, or it might not be as good of a threat as you once thought it was. Now, if we sit here and talk about how to calculate and all these things all day, it might not exactly help unless we see some examples. So I thought it would be nice to look at a classic game that I'm sure you've seen already, but look at it under the lens of these forcing moves. And this is the opera game, and featuring Paul Morphy with the white pieces, which is considered to be one of the most instructive and best games of all time. So the moves at the opening aren't really too important. Here, there's actually a threat in the position. If we see, the threat is to take the pawn potentially. So, well, black defends it. And now we see d4, trying to open the position and gain some central space. And bishop to g4, which is considered not really to be a strong move. So after bishop to g4, now we can start doing some calculation. Well, right now, in this position, what we would love to do is, if you can calculate it, and you can do it only by captures if you'd like, can you try to calculate a way to win material here, which is a strategically desirable thing? So the answer, let's just say a6 is played, is to take on e5. And after they recapture back, because of course we should look at what they do, which is checks, captures, and then lastly threats. Threats are the least important here, but they capture back. We give a check and capture, so very forcing. They capture, and we capture. As we can see, all of these forcing moves led us to a calculation where we won a pawn and have some threats. White is actually close to winning, if not already winning in this position. So let's go back. Here, bishop to g4 aims to stop the threat. After taking on e5, now the problem is, of course, you do not capture back, because captures, and captures, right? And luckily enough, there's also a threat at the end of the line, which isn't super important, but it's something to point out. But of course, there's a different capture here, which is bishop takes on f3. So of course, we don't want to take on d6. We really should just recapture on f3 here because, well, we are down material unless we recapture. So that's why bishop takes f3 takes priority in this position. After queen takes f3, as we can see, there's a lot of forcing moves going on here, mainly with captures, sometimes a check. So after queen takes on f3 here, we see d takes e5. And now white has a few options. And, well, the way we can look at what to do here when we're trying to calculate some ideas is, well, where are the forcing moves? So, of course, you might look at bishop to b5 check. Check is the most important move to look at, but after c6, it's not really sure, or it's not really that great. So, yeah, bishop b5 is probably not the right call here. Knight to c3 is a good move. It develops a piece, but it doesn't really make a threat. And here, the answer, yes, is actually to make a threat, because there aren't any captures, besides queen takes f7, but of course that's not so great. So here, bishop to c4 creates a threat of checkmate on f7, which is a very good move. It's a developing move that also creates a threat. You don't need to create a threat, by the way. If you're playing a game, you don't see any threats, checks, or captures, that means it's likely a quiet position that you can just develop and focus on strategic goals. And funnily enough, later this week, I will be releasing a video on how to understand what your strategic goals in a position may be. So after bishop to c4, black has to respond to this threat. So we can reasonably calculate that something like queen to f6 or knight to f6, I'm going to get rid of some of the arrows, blocking the check or defending it in some way is going to be the answer. So here, knight to f6 was chosen, and instead of developing immediately, Paul Morphy came up with a really interesting move. So can you see any interesting moves that are also forcing in nature? Hopefully you had some time to pause here, but the move is queen to b3, which creates a threat on f7 and also on b3, which is a very strong move, because now again black has to respond to it and actually can't respond to both. If Paul Morphy wanted to, after queen e7, which was played in the game, because this is the bigger threat, if you end up defending b7 here, taking on f7 is an absolute nightmare. The king has to move, loses castling rights, is stuck in the center of the board, and this is completely lost. But after queen to b3, it's a double attack, and you can actually cash in, if you would like, with taking on b7, which will win you a pawn. But Paul Morphy goes for more. Now, knight to c3. Okay, so now it's time to develop. There's not always going to be a check, capture, or threat in a position that's necessarily good. Queen takes b7 is still a fine move, of course. Now we see c6 to defend the pawn. Now this capture is no longer possible. And, well, Morphy just increases the pressure with bishop to g5. So there's not quite a threat in this position yet. However, we can see that white has a huge lead in development and has potential threats in the air. After bishop to g5, black went crazy a little bit and played b5. And here, now it's time to calculate a little bit more. Do we move the bishop or do we take on b5? And if you've seen this game before, you may know that taking on b5 is actually the correct answer. So this involves a lot of strategic and tactical themes, but we're just going to look at this under the guise of calculation. After knight takes on b5, well, they have to respond to it. Otherwise, we just want a clean pawn. So the only move to calculate really is taking on b5. This is a check, so we should at least consider it. But we can just move away, and winning this pawn is a huge deal, and we'll win the game. So instead, c takes b5, and, well, what can we do here? We can actually give a check. And again, this is a very forcing move. So knight b to d7. How can you force more in the position? Now, you look at checks first, and then you look at your captures, and then you look at your threats. Because if you can force a win with only checks, just do it, right? If you can with captures, do it. If you can with threats, of course, that's the one you least likely want to have, because sometimes there's a lot more counterplay. But, well, you should also do it. So we can clearly see that black is completely tied up here because, well, this knight can't move because it's pinned by the bishop. This knight can't move because it's pinned by this bishop. This queen is on a very active square. And the only pieces not really doing anything are these rooks in the corner. But if you've seen the game, you know that changes soon. So we need to look at this position and try to find some forcing moves. So if we end up going by checks first, which we should, we notice that bishop takes d7 is playable. Now they have to recapture. That is the forcing move that makes sense here. There's no check that they can play because they're in check themselves. So after bishop takes d7, there's knight takes d7, but there's something wrong with this, and that's bishop takes on e7. So of course the queen will take, and although this looks quite reasonable, rook to d1 for example looks quite strong, it's a little unclear because, well, we're already having to look at threats in this position instead of the more forcing moves, which are the checks and the captures. Maybe taking on f6, but after takes back, our calculation kind of ends here. We can make some threats, but it's a little unclear where we go from here. So instead, let's look at another capture, which is taking on f6. So of course, if black were to take with the queen, maybe you can consider taking on d7 immediately, or even long castles, which is a bit of a spoiler. But maybe instead g takes f6, and, well, now black can develop their bishop maybe to g7 and can hope for some sort of future. Some tension has been released here. So instead, these things lead to unclear scenarios. Instead, long castles, which is a threat, the least forcing but still something you should look at move, is the answer here. Where after long castles, despite the first two moves not being good, when you go down the list and you have a bunch of things you can calculate, generally one of them hopefully will work out for you, as long as the tactics do work in your favor, of course. So after long castles, now all of a sudden there is a threat, not to take the queen, that would be quite surprising, but to take the knight. Because now, again, this knight cannot capture, so let's just say a6, a really silly move. But bishop takes d7, the knight cannot capture because the bishop will win the queen. The king cannot capture because the rook is actually covering the bishop. And also, the queen cannot capture because we can take the queen and win material. So there are no longer many good options if they just waste time. So they have to play something extremely defensive here. And of course, rook to d8 was played. This is the only move that covers the knight enough, so if rook takes, well, it can be covered. And this is actually what was played in the game, but let's look at some other options first. If bishop takes on d7, now there's rook takes d7. And unfortunately, you're not quite getting the results you want as white, because, well, what's the follow-up? If we capture, then now after queen takes on d7, I mean, it looks quite nice after bishop takes f6, but we are down a full piece, so it's unlikely that this is actually enough. But okay, so taking with check is not really the answer. What about just a capture and no check? Bishop takes on f6 here. Well, this looks quite reasonable. We're trading pieces of equal material, but we are down material as well, and we're getting rid of what was a strong attacker. After g takes f6, it's a little unclear how good this may be. So, of course, let's go back. If we're a little unclear after just a move or two, maybe it's not the answer. And here, there's actually a really strong one, and it's a capture, which is the second most forcing move, which is rook takes d7. And black is forced to respond to this in some way, because not only is it a capture, but it's also a threat. There's a threat of a discovery, taking the queen or the rook. You can't really ignore the capture of material. And again, that's kind of why it's so forcing. So after rook takes d7, of course, if the queen takes, we win the queen, so we're not too concerned about that. Same with the knight. The king cannot take it because it is protected by the bishop. So rook takes is the only move we look at. And we can actually calculate that from back here. We can see that after rook takes, the only reasonable move is rook takes back in return. It just takes some visualization to see it. So after rook takes d7, rook takes d7. Now, well, let's look at some moves again. After bishop takes on d7, we can see queen takes on d7 here. But after queen takes d7, again, it kind of looks like they're getting out. If we play rook to d1, we get some activity, but it might be a little unclear how good this activity really is. For example, after queen to c7. And even though you get this nice check, maybe after king to e7, it's not so clear. Maybe there's enough room to get out here. Despite it looking awkward, it's hard to find a follow-up after this move because, well, we have to remember that we are down a piece as white. So this doesn't look quite right. However, what about bishop takes f6? Now, if queen takes f6, for example, we could try taking on d7, but we can also try adding pressure to this rook on d7 here, which is the least forcing, but it's still something reasonable to look at. Of course, it looks like maybe black can try holding on here with queen to e7. Luckily, this is completely winning for white here if they end up just taking on d7 and taking on d7 once again. And this actually gets us to calculate a forcing variation that is winning. So we could go down this if we'd like, but Morphy is a very strong player and he decides to do something a little different here. Rook to d1. The least forcing again, but the first two options were good, but bishop takes f6, the one that we just looked at, even though it should be winning, well, it looks like there might be more as well. And rook to d1 still has the option of bishop takes f6 anyways, so there's not really any harm in trying it out. So in the game, queen to e6 was played, and now we can calculate a forced win. So just by using checks, captures, and threats, we can actually win this game now. So I'll give you a few seconds to pause and try to figure it out. So the answer here is bishop takes on d7 with check. Hey, look, it's a check. That's really nice. And they have to respond to it, really. If they move their king in any way, we win their queen. So that's not really anything to be concerned about. So now after knight takes d7, we have to calculate again. So looking at checks first, queen takes e6 looks quite reasonable. But after f takes e6, well, we are down a piece, and it looks like black's actually pretty safe here. So this looks like it ruins the game, and we don't really want to do that. There is one other check, but it looks a little crazy, doesn't it? But if we calculate queen to b8, there's only one response, and that's a capture, a forcing move. Knight takes b8, and now we can calculate once again checks, captures, and then threats. Of course, this one is the most forcing, a check that cannot be stopped in any way. Whether the king can move, it cannot. Can it be captured? It cannot. And can something be blocked in between? Well, there's no space in between the pieces anyway, so no, it cannot. So anyways, I hope that was helpful as just a reminder really quick. When you're looking and trying to calculate in a position, you look at checks first because they're the most forcing, captures next because if you take material off the board, that is a pretty significant thing, and lastly threats because sometimes threats can be ignored. And of course, sometimes there's not going to be any of those things, so keep that in mind as well. Not every position is a tactic, and that's one of the hardest things to come to the conclusion of. But regardless, I hope that this has given you some insight on how to calculate better, clean up your calculation a bit, and, well, improve your chess. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.